So yes, this afternoon will focus on forestry, which I know is a important issue for you all, and we will start with our keynote speaker. Am I speaking too loud? Yes. He is a professor at the Swedish Agriculture and Forestry University. He is a civil culture and also working on carbon farming, which is a rather topical issue. A lot of you know that the Commission proposed the framework on carbon removals yesterday, so thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I also know that he has slides, so you know how to work that thing, right?
I think so, yeah.
So I'll leave you to it.
Okay. Thank you very much for this introduction. I also would like to start with thanking the organizers for inviting me to this very exciting event. I will give you a short talk about the forest and the forest sector and what kind of forest we need to meet the future demands. I will have a very strong, you can say, focus on Nordic conditions, of course, since we are now up in the northern parts of Europe, so we are in Sweden, a very forested country. But before I start with my talk, I would like to just give you a small reflection of why do we actually do management? Why do we have cropping systems? It seems that this is easily forgotten today in society. I thought it was well put by this old professor Heinrich Cotta in the early 1800s that he concluded that there would be no forest science or forest management without the constant deficiency of wood supply. I mean, it has always been deficiency when it comes to these natural resources. So I don't think we should take it for given that we always can get whatever we need. And then since nature, if nature could by itself, the natural nature could provide society with all our needs, we shouldn't do cropping. We should just go out there and bring it into our households. So for all of you that are representing the landowner associations, I think this is a kind of an important take-home message. We expect landowners to be much better than nature to provide society with whatever we are needing. So we take that with us now when we start to talk about the forest again. And then I would exemplify some of the benefits from the forest sector related to climate change mitigation. And it's a little bit of a dilemma that the forest is actually doing climate benefit in two ways. And this is also one of the reasons for why we have such a heated debate on what is the best way of using our forests. But if you have a cropping system with rather high growth and then you leave the large part of the annual growth in the forest as a growing stock, then you remove carbon from the atmosphere. And that can then buffer for emissions from other sources like oil and cement. And this is, of course, a benefit. It's good if you can do that. But on the other hand, you could also harvest most of this annual growth and use that to produce services and products and that can be used instead of this oil and cement. So then we avoid an addition of carbon to the atmospheric cycle that didn't exist there before. So it's like two sides of a coin, and there's two different benefits. And with a constant growth in the cropping system, then one benefit can only increase at the cost of lowering the other benefit. And still we are having a big debate whether one or the other is better. And I will try to talk a little bit more about alternative discussions that we could have. I mean, what we actually need is the climate policy calls for a maintained carbon sink, even an increased carbon sink. And for the forest is like pinpointed very many times as the major resource to be used. But we also need to increase the availability of forest raw materials for consumption. to replace the use of oil and cement. So this is kind of a challenge then. So we need to save more of the annual growth as creating a buffer and a carbon sink, but we also want to increase the availability of harvested wood products in some way. And I have heard several talkers and speakers today that have emphasized the importance of having a system perspective, that we can't just view the forest as such or a single stand or something like that. We have to understand that what happens in the forest will have effects in society and vice versa. So we have to look at this in a kind of a socio-ecological system. And by doing that, I would like then to suggest a few options that could perhaps help us to get more or less more of everything. And, so how do we then maintain and preferably increase the carbon sink at the same time as we increase the availability of forest-based products then? Well, of course, first we have to go back to the landowners and ask them, can you continue to develop your cropping system? You have been developing this for hundreds of years and you learn more things. We have new science and you can perhaps do this a little bit even better. And we have to consider all kinds of values provided by the forest, not only the growth and yield standard thinking, but also environmental issues and social issues has to be considered. Another thing that I think is important in the perspective of the Paris Agreement, it's to start to think about the carbon sink as a commercial assortment. If it's a true value for society, this value should be given a market price. It should be priced of a market in some way. And we will discuss a little bit more about that. But a third thing that is important to consider is this really big potential of increasing recycling and reuse of forest-based products. If we were able to develop systems where we could reuse the fiber 15 times instead of 6 or 7 times, if we could reuse solid wood products at least once more before it ends up as bioenergy, that will more or less double the availability of these forest-based products. I think that is worth thinking about. And then when it comes to the carbon sink issues, in the long term, we know that there will not be enough room in the forest to store more and more and more and more carbon forever. So sometime we have to find another solution, and that's obviously a technical solution. And we could start installing or at least creating incentives for bioenergy carbon capture and storage systems to be installed at a larger, you can say, rate than today. We see some small steps in that direction, but that could really be encouraged to go faster. So then I will give you a few personal reflections on the voluntary carbon market with the Swedish context then. And we have been discussing this, or at least I have been discussing it with quite many landowners, and they get surprised when I ask them who owns the carbon in the trees. And I think it's a very stupid question. But if you look at the land use change activities, for example, it's negotiated. The carbon and the carbon sink is negotiated at the national levels. And I don't think that many of you as landowners has been part of that negotiation. So now when Sweden has a little bit more to do in this sector, it's not clear that the landowner said, oh fine, we will fix that. So it's perhaps that should be discussed a little bit more often. Who is owning the value of a carbon sink? Can that be someone else than the landowner? And if we are going for market-based solutions in some way to get a price on this value then, how should that be done? Should it be, I have heard it several times here already, and should it be then a top-down or a bottom-up approach? Should there be some kind of adaptation to local, regional, and national levels, or should it be the standard one-size-fits-all solution? So I think that most of you will claim that it has to be some kind of regional or national kind of adaptation to make this work. And I took then, compared the value of the carbon credits traded on the global market today, which is mostly found in North America and other places of the world. It's not so much in Europe. But if we take the present carbon sink in the managed forest in Sweden and then assume that the market price is something that is similar to what we see on average on the global scale, the market value should be for Sweden something between 200 and 400 million euros at an annual basis. And most of that is then what could end up in the pockets of the landowners if this business models were to be developed. And the value, of course, has been kind of recognized by several other actors. And we see now, this is what I know, I can see that there are at least 4 actors in Sweden trying to develop business models related to carbon credits or carbon sinks. So there are 3 in the forest sector and there is 1 in the agriculture sector. And they are kind of starting, they are beginners in a way. They are developing this, and we will see what happens in the future, whether it's going to be a commercial, successful activity. But then I think that there are some conditions that has to be met and to discussed. And the first thing, I heard it earlier today, this also that if you have something that is considered to be of a value at your property, then it should be valued as a commodity regardless of if it was intended to be created by the landowner or not. It's really strange that we see on the carbon credit market that it is a kind of a behavioral change that is valued. So if you're doing really bad things and then you do something better, then this is considered to be a good change. But what if we have in the Nordic countries where you already are maintaining a high carbon sink? Then is it only if you increase the carbon sink a little bit more that you can get value for this increase? Or should you get some kind of support for what you're already doing in terms of good things? This is an important thing to discuss. And we should focus on carbon removal when it comes to the forest sector. In the agriculture sector, I think it's reducing emissions. So the 2 land uses should be separated when you develop the business models. And we need, of course, a standard for calculating a carbon sink. And an important thing to consider is also how do you compare different carbon sinks? I mean, if you have a technical carbon sink, that is the permanence of that can be 300 to 1500 years. And how do you compare that with the carbon sink in a spruce forest that might be only 30 or 40 or 50 years or something? So that has to be done. But the last and most important thing, I think, is that as a landowner, I should recommend you that you claim that additionality means that you store more carbon at your property at the end of the year than you did at the beginning of the year. So the reference should be the carbon stock. The reference should not be the carbon stock change, which is today, I can say, I think that the most common definition of additionality. Just a few words before I stop then about a system perspective that you could take as landowners. First, you have the trees. They are fantastic machines in concentrating carbon dioxide from the air into biomass. 50% of the dry weight is carbon, and you have that then in the trees. If you do not harvest the annual growth, you will create a carbon sink in the forest. But then the landowner is concentrating this carbon even more by bringing the timber to the roadside. And then we concentrate it again by bringing the timber from the roadside to the forest industry. So we have a highly concentrated, you can say, carbon assortment coming into this industry. And then we produce products that could also act as carbon sinks if the harvested product stock is increasing. And here you have the potential of reusing and recycling and doing all kinds of things. And normally then, in the end of life of all these products, we take out the energy and burn it and get bioenergy, and it's released back to the atmosphere, and we call this like a circular flow. But then I just questioned, why do we have to let it out into the atmosphere again? If we had investors investing in this carbon capture and storage system, we could ask the spruces to take up the carbon, and we use the chimneys to remove the carbon from the system and store it into the bedrock again. So we could create a linear flow of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere back into the bedrock. So it's like using oil, but the other way around. So my final slide then is relating to what you said here in the beginning, that there was a proposal about how to certify carbon removals in Europe that came out yesterday evening. I think, given what I have said so far, now it's probably one of the last moments when there is a window of opportunity to act. If you want to influence this in some way, it's time now. I think it's worth at least considering, since if we get this to turn into generating carbon sinks that builds up a stronger standing stock in your cropping system, it will in the long run result in increased growth. So it's a good way of financing investments for increasing growth and harvest possibilities in the future. And if we could collaborate in some way and making these natural and technical carbon sinks to function together and create a market together, I think it has the potential to create rather significant added values, not only for the forest owners, but also for the forest industry and of course for society in general. So by that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Lundmark. Please sit down. And before I ask others to join you, thank you for already giving us some idea of what to ask the Commission with their recent proposal. You mentioned additionality. There's a few other aspects in the proposal that are a bit up in the air. There's not much details yet. But one of them that is missing currently is liability. The fact that, for instance, if there's, especially now with climate change being the factor that affects forest ecosystems the most, if there is a forest fire, if there is a storm, if there is bark beetle infestation, how that could affect the carbon removals framework. Have you had any thought about it? I'm picking your brain.
Well, I mean, of course, you have always to consider disturbances as a risk factor and mortality. But there is a lot of talk about resilience and you want to have stable ecosystems. But there is always one factor that is very seldom mentioned, and that is actually the manager, the landowner. I mean, if you have a very active landowner, that is the best insurance, I think, to reduce these kind of disturbances and risks. So now in Sweden, for example, we have had the large bark beetle attacks, but that has been handled in a good way by the landowners. So then you redirect your harvest operations to that kind of sources. But you could also, of course, I mean, and another thing in Sweden is that when it comes to fire as a disturbance, in Sweden it's so rare that we have wildfires. So instead we have to, sometimes we even give subsidies to landowners to start a fire as a nature conservation measure. Beside that, I think that you, of course, in a business model, you have to have a kind of an insurance system. So you have to have some kind of buffer that keeps some of these carbon credits that are not sold. But that can be easily solved, I think, by people that understand business. I'm only in silviculture, so it's a little bit out
Well,
of my scope.
thank you. A lot of food for thought there. The example you gave of the paying to start a fire is a good example of a trade-off between climate change and biodiversity at times, isn't it? But well, now it's time for you not to be alone. So I start with Pierre Olivier, which is a familiar face to most of you, president of the LO, my boss.
No, not really.
But also vice president of the Foundation François Sommer, and he's been involved also with forestry, being president of a cooperative in the north of France since 2016.
Yeah.
So I got it right. Next would be, you're there. Linda Eriksson, so forest director at the Swedish Forest Industries. So we have the value chain with us. The next one will be Konstantin Kingsky, which is not here, but he should be still with us anyhow. Could I see him? Will I see him later? Oh, is there? There we go. So he is, he doesn't look too sick, but apparently that's the reason why he's not here. And is calling us from the Czech Republic, and where is member of the board of the SVOL, which is the private forest chamber of the Czech Republic. Thank you, Konstantin. And last but not least, Gabrielle Morner, which is still alive, and is a member of the Swedish Landowners Association. He also chairs the forestry committee there, and is also a landowner and entrepreneur since 2016. Is that right? Good. We had a good start. You can not only reply to some of the things our keynote speaker said, but also start by introducing yourselves and also the main challenges you see for the forest sector currently. I will start with Pierre Olivier.
Okay,
Mr. President.
Thank you. So as Anna just told you, I'm a forest owner in France, in Normandy, and also the president of a forest cooperative operating north of Paris up to the Belgian border. So as a cooperative, we work for our members, of course, who are forest owners, and we offer them services to write down the management plan, to sell the wood coming from the forest, to have them felling the wood, replanting, and caring about the forest. And our main concern, and the concern of our forest owners, is to have sustainable managed forests. And in fact, this is compulsory in my country, and it is the same, I think, in the most members of the Union. All forests above 25 hectares have to have a management plan, a long-term management plan, and usually it's 15 years. And we help the forest owners to think what will be the forest during those 15 years and after that, and write it down and present it to the local authorities. So then what are we trying to do is to face the threats which might occur on the forest of our forest owners. And of course, today, one of the main threats is the climate change, because it's changing so rapidly that the forests really suffer from climate change already, even in our region, where we still have some rain and we still have temperatures which are, reasonably hot in summer, but just the same, they do suffer from climate change. Are there any other threats? If you listen to the TV, they say that the main threat is overcropping forests. We don't think this is the case. At least it's not the case in my region, it's not the case in France, and I don't think it's the case in Europe as a whole. In fact, we only crop less than 50% of the annual biological growth of the forest. That means, in fact, that wood is piling up in forests. It might be a good thing as a carbon sink, but it's piling up. And the problem is that there is a threat, but it's not a threat of overcropping. It's another kind of threat, that at the end of the day, if we don't fell the trees, if you, when the trees are adult and mature, what will happen? At the end of the day, nature will crop them on its own, and nature is not always very nice. Because in the south, and you know that because you come from Portugal, it'll be fire. In the north, it'll be the storm, and everywhere it will be bark beetles or the diseases. Then overnight, you might have the total of the forest, the total of the biodiversity, the total of the carbon being sent back to the atmosphere without any use for anybody. So we feel that we have to have a sustainable management of forest, but you have also to crop and fell the trees and use them as you, Professor, you just told us about, but to use it as a substitute of fossil material and fossil energy. And then I come to my main point, is that there is a new kind of threat, but nobody seems to tell something about that, which is the lack of action in forests by the forest owners. Because they listen to the radio, they listen to the grandchildren saying, oh, why do you cut trees? You're destroying the forest. But this is not the case. They are regeneration, and the risk is not to do anything in the forest because of that. And in fact, it's a real risk. We see it, and even with our members, especially with small forest owners, because if we don't act, facing climate change, you might have at the end of the day forests which won't be anymore resilient. For instance, in my region, it's a region where we have mainly broadleaves and beech trees. And we know, because scientists have been studying the thing, that in 50 years' time, most of this forest will not exist anymore because beech will not survive the climate change because it's so rapid. It cannot adapt to this situation. And there is a need for action, a need to try and imagine another forest with other species. And we have to discuss that. To discuss that with scientists, to discuss that also with society, because the landscape is going to change. For instance, in my region, even in my forest, we are now replanting, instead of beech, which has been felled, oak, or sometimes Douglas tree, or pine tree, because they have a capacity to resist dry summers. And the oaks we are planting, they are not local oaks. They are oaks coming from in southern part of France, because even the oaks, the pedunculata, are not really adapted to the situation. We need oaks which are used to hotter place and can resist to hot summers and to drought. So you need action. So the forest is really resilient, and if the foresters don't do it, I mean, there might be a real threat for the future of forest. And to end my presentation, I would like to tell something about the wording you use, because we think of the forest as producing wood, and being a carbon sink. And when you say that, you have the feeling there is a contradiction, because carbon sink means to keep the carbon in the forest. But in fact, this is not what we mean. And we should try and use another wording, in my opinion, which is a carbon pump. The forest is meant to work as a carbon pump, to take the forest from the atmosphere, to put it in the trees for some time, for temporary time, as you just presented before, and then to offer it to society for other use where it can be stocked for building or go into pulp or energy in substitution of material coming from fossil origin. So, I mean, then if you use this all kind of wording, you then feel that there is no contradiction between being concerned by carbon pumping in the atmosphere and producing wood out of your forest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre-Olivier. I think the concept of carbon pump also goes well together with the innovation of BECCS. So not only with the substitution, but even if we pump it back into the ground, the terminology is pretty good. Well, you said a lot of things that we probably will pick up a bit later, namely migration of species, communication, which was also a topic that was mentioned this morning. Well, communication problems, rather. And the strategic plans. And before I move on to Linda, on the strategic plans, you mentioned that is already a requirement in France. In fact, it's a requirement in a lot of other countries. But the Commission is still mulling the proposal to have a European requirement for a strategic plan. What do you think of this idea?
Well, we're not very happy, I must say, with some of the ideas in the forest strategy. For this idea of, I mean, protecting forest, but protecting in a sense not to do anything in forest, to have 10% of strictly protected and 30% of forest being managed in free evolution. Free evolution is a kind of wording which means you don't do anything in the forest and you don't use the trees and you don't fell them for industry. And we don't think this is the right option. Neither do we think that it's the right option, this concept of restoration. Because restoration means that we should go back in the past. There are no longer any primary forests in Europe, really. And with climate change, we cannot go back to the past. It won't work. On the contrary, you need to imagine the future, and the future will be a different forest of the one which existed at the time of the Romans or the Middle Ages or even in the 19th century. So I don't think this the whole of the concept put forward by the Commission today and discussed at European level is really the right approach in our conception, at least.
Let's hope they're listening.
We can discuss that.
Now we pass from a landowner perspective to the industry. So Linda, take it on.
Yeah, I can agree with many things that have been said. We see this climate is changing, and we also see at the same time a global demand for forest products growing. And I think that forests maybe never have been so important for a sustainable society as it is today. And the products and the energy that we can get from the forest is a key to climate mitigation. And then it's kind of stressful to look at the Commission and their suggestions regarding forests, since they seem to focus very much on the part of forest as a sink, and not as much as the part that it could help with substitution, using wood and bioenergy instead of the fossil side. I think also we need, we see that we need changes, of course, in how we manage forest in this situation with the climate change. And I would also like to stress the importance of plant breeding, producing new forests that are more able to handle the new climate and the new environmental phase.
So, am I right to assume that the availability of raw material might be a concern for the industry?
Absolutely, yeah.
What would you ask policymakers to help with that problem?
But I think, like Thomas said before, also you need a system perspective. You can't just dig into the carbon sink, or you need to see the whole picture, I think.
Okay, well, thank you. Now we move to a virtual speaker. Constantine, still there? Yes, you are. Take it on.
Hello, and sorry for forcing my ugly mug on you from upstairs behind the speakers. I'm very glad to be with you. I couldn't agree more with what has been said, and you know, as a manager of forest, I cannot wait for Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to agree what will happen to climate change. And you know, we welcome the big picture, the fact that we are at Sharm el-Sheikh trying to do things and so forth, but at the end, I have a forest to manage, and we cannot wait, as Pierre-Olivier has said. We are building our forest plans on a 2 degrees Celsius global warming increase, which probably means closer to 3 on the ground here at the heart of Europe, which, by the way, Pierre-Olivier, means that the beech that are dying in your forest are growing in ours. So there's an element of European solidarity there.
Good news.
But we do need a mindset change. And I'd like to use the metaphor what's happening with the energy sector. We've been talking about the need for action, the need for management, the need for proactive introduction of management, different management styles in our forest, the species and so forth. And things are very slow. The same has been happening with energy. And suddenly, because of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, everybody is ready to invest in heat pumps and renewables and so forth, because we don't want to pay 5 to 10 times more, and because we do not want to support this aggressor by paying for gas. And suddenly, I have everybody trying to help me to find solutions to heat the 3.5 hectares of roofs that I'm in charge of. The same hopefully can happen quicker than in energy in forestry. We do not have time, and the main threat to forest, as Pierre-Olivier has said, is not climate change. It is us. It is our human behavior. Climate change is only doing, or the pests like the bark beetle that we're all suffering from here, is only finishing up the bad job that we as humans are doing. A precise example, a fact to illustrate that: Bavaria versus Czech Republic. Bavaria and Czech Republic have basically more or less the same geography, the same stands, the same altitude, the same rain, the same type of forests. Bavaria has 1 million hectares of Norway spruce. Czech has 1.3 million, so 30% more. The Czech Republic has had to cull 5 times more, not 30%, 500% more than Bavaria of bark beetle. So you can explain climate change, use climate change to explain 30% of the problem, but the remaining 4.7 times is us. And one key issue is the fact that we believe too often, society too often believes that not doing anything is the right thing. We need to reduce the length of the cycle in forest, because climate change is an issue of 20 to maybe 60 years, but probably closer to 20 than close to 60, whereas in the normal cycle in the forest is anywhere between 60 and 120. In the Czech Republic, the average Norway spruce stand was 170 years old before we had the last 5 years of drought and bark beetle epidemics. that is way too old. Those trees are not resilient. They are too dense. They don't have enough access to water. I know that in Sweden you have a much quicker cycle, and because forestry in Central Europe is very much inspired from the boreal forest model that you are the model for. I think we should inspire ourselves from the fact that in Sweden you manage your forest with a much quicker cycle, which enables us to, at the same time, prepare other species, more mixed stands, more diverse age classes, work on water retention by repairing the network of water springs and all that. So I very much support what Pierre-Olivier has said, and that we are in an absolutely dire situation. We have 20, maybe 30 years. We're already a bit late, and we need to actively manage our forests. That means a mindset change for people on the ground. And funnily enough, our experience here is that, of course, foresters are conservative, and they have a tendency to believe that the right thing to do is to return forest to the status it was in before the forester intervened. But actually, it's even more difficult to convince many nature conservatives, specialists of ecology, that the right thing is to look forward and to prepare for what we believe the future, a potential future for the forest could be, rather than think that you should manage the forest by returning it to a past theoretical equilibrium. The last time we had 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer climates in Central Europe, there was only pine. What should I do? Cut all the trees and return it to a pine tree as 10,000 years ago? Or should I look forward and maybe plant a little more beech and maybe even oak? I have to fight with the local environmental agency to be allowed to try oak. That is absurd. So a mindset change for people on the ground, and at the same time a mindset change, I'm sorry to say, in the minds of regulators, politicians, policymakers, and to move from prescription to motivation. The reality is we do not know. Nobody on the ground, let alone in Brussels or in governments, knows what the future forest will look like. And therefore we need to be humble. And humility in ecological terms is called biodiversity, and in management terms it's called flexibility. And if you prescribe rules, you're not sure that they are the right ones, and you're quite sure that you have 100-something members of parliament pushing 160 million people on the ground to do what they believe is the right thing, that's not going to work. Look at what is happening with energy. Suddenly the whole system changes, prices changes, mindset changes, and you move from prescription to motivation, and suddenly you have 160 million citizens working to do the right thing. So please, let's continue to think, as was suggested by the first speaker, about ways to motivate managers to do the right thing for their forest and for society. Look at carbon sinks. Don't try to find theoretical perfect solutions. It's better to have one solution that we test, and maybe a bit underpriced, but is certified, so that we create transparency and stability. Look at the multiple services that forests produce. The example of Munich is a very good one to me, where the city of Munich has bought 1,500 hectares of forest, and thanks to that, they have clean water for free. And if you count the price of the forest in there, then the clean water costs something like 6 times less than if it was filtered artificially. And so forth. So move from prescription to motivation at the top-down level, and a sense of urgency that we need to propagate in the minds of managers, nature conservation specialists, and society around us. Thank you.
Thank you, Constantin. Again, some comparison with the discussions this morning with incentives, trust, and in this sense also flexibility, and now because forests have a timeline that is slightly different from agriculture, which the timing was an important point that you mentioned too. Going now from the Central Europe to Sweden.
North of Europe. Yeah, thank you. I was just picking up where we stopped before, the biodiversity thing. And when we listen to journalists and politicians in Europe or in Sweden, and better in Sweden than in Europe, but they talk of forests like it's the homogeneous thing, like it's almost like a cube, a product that exists, and you can do some things, and it's the same forest in the south of Europe or in the north of Europe. And everyone in here knows that's not the case. It's very different if you go to Greece, to the north of Sweden, and even in Sweden, it's extremely different from the south to the north. So we have to stop thinking of the forest. It's a lot of forests, and every forest property is unique. And within every forest property, all the areas are unique. So you have to somehow start on the ground with the property owner, the landowner, the forest owner. How should they manage their forests? In Sweden, there are over 300,000 forest owners who manage their forests. Most of them are inherited from since generations. They know best how to manage their forests. They know their property. They know how to handle it. Many politicians would like to decide how to manage the forests, almost in detail, from far above, and it doesn't work. As I said, different forests in different places, different forests in one property. It's impossible to manage it from above. What you can do is make big strategies. What should we have the forest for? Is it good for carbon capture, biodiversity? Then let the management of the forest, just the responsibility and the management be a part of the landowner's responsibility. But the landowner also needs help, education, and that's what I think the government and the authorities should help forest owners with. Education. How will we manage this with the climate change, the new conditions? What do we need? Better plans, and so on. We have so much we can do, and I think almost all forest owners wants to manage their forest in the best possible way. So trust, as you said before, it's very important, and just leave it to the forest owners.
Okay. Thank you also for that. Before I try the audience, I have some questions. Maybe I'll start with Konstantin Kiński, because you gave an example of in Bavaria with water and a payment for ecosystem services in that regard. We have now a movement with the carbon removals proposal to trying to instigate carbon markets, and in a way also a payment for ecosystem services in that way. What do you think we could do for other types of ecosystems to scale up some of these initiatives?
Well, funnily enough, in this country, we are more advanced in trying to calculate the value of ecological services of a forest than on carbon sink. And I suspect that the reason, maybe this is not something that is pleasant to say, or not everybody will agree, but I suspect one of the reasons is that the green politicians, associations don't see much potential because they feel that there is so much wood, so much forest in Europe, that if we talk about carbon sink, we're at the risk of not being motivated to do enough, that we will sort of escape out of the problem by focusing on forestry as carbon pumps. And by the way, I'm currently working on a carbon sink that arose from a carbon pump because my table is made out of wood. So we are more advanced in discussing the topic you mentioned. There are some academic works being produced, some experiments on the ground. Unfortunately, this is more driven by theoreticians, and I would like to see more best practice sharing, such as the one I mentioned with Munich, that now the issue of the cost of water filtration, for example, via the soil and the sound forest, compared to the overall cost, including carbon cost of producing, managing artificial water filtration system, could be a good place to start. And the second difficulty that we have is also because largely this effort is so far driven by academics and maybe by, how should I say, by absolutists. We're trying to define the perfect solution, and that's not going to work. I would prefer an approach where we tranche the issue, the problem, and maybe we start, for example, sorting out the issue of the value of water filtration that forestry brings, and set up a system to promote that. And then look at soil retention and maybe set up a second system to maybe have a more phased approach instead of trying to find the perfect magic wand that will solve everything.
Thank you.
For water filtration, as I mentioned, I think the ratio can be calculated, and it's probably something from 6 to 1 between artificial filtration and the cost of filtration naturally through a forest.
Thank you, Constantin. Anyone wants to come in on the payment for ecosystem services for forests?
Yeah. It's a difficult question because obviously forests provide ecosystem services, but is there anybody prepared to pay for it? That's the first question. But even if somebody is prepared to pay for it, what are the constraints which are going to be put on the forest if it's paid for? I take the example of the quality of water. And I have an example in mind. In the northern part of France, the community of Lille, which is a large city in the north of France, offered foresters in a certain area to stop doing anything in the forest and fence them so nobody could enter the forest. And no felling, no carrying, no entering, no path, no car, nothing coming in the forest for water protection. And we're going to pay for that. But then it totally protected, nobody enters the forest. Is that what we want for ecosystem services? My feeling is that we need to invest to imagine ecosystem services which play on the multi functionality of forest. That at the same time you can protect the quality of forest, make a carbon pump, actually pump the forest, and use the forest for producing wood at the same time if you run it, if you manage it in a proper way. And this is what it is about. So I think we should be careful that with this idea of ecosystem services, because some people have, well, strange intention behind that, which we to have a totally protected forest, and it's a way to do so. We pay you, and then you stop doing anything.
Good point. I know, Professor Thomas, you wanted to come in on this?
Well, I would think I would like to comment on this because it's of course it's a trade-off between developing market prices on other ecosystem services than the roundwood. Of course, you can have this fear that there will be some rich guys paying for not doing anything, but on the other alternative will be that you will safeguard these other values by restrictions. So I'm not sure whether one or the other is better, but I know that in Sweden now, for example, there are, as I showed you, several actors trying to develop business models that allow companies that has remaining emissions that they can't get rid of to pay those that are removing that carbon, so to balance their emissions with an uptake in a forest. And it's quite simple actually to measure carbon when you have these good figures and data that we have in many forested countries. So that can be transparent, and it can be verifiable, and it can be, I think it can probably work if there's a market that develops. But on the other hand, in Sweden again, the landowners are doing a great effort in protecting biodiversity voluntarily. On more than 1 million hectares of forest land, they set aside voluntarily. And of course, at this land, instead of just leaving it there for free development, if there were investors wanting to share responsibility for a richer biodiversity, they could offer these voluntary set-asides as nature conservation projects where you have a management plan to increase you can say, the biodiversity value density per area. So by doing then several kinds of different measures that we know will give a richer biodiversity, that could increase the conservation value or the nature value of these areas. But you have to find someone else than the landowner to pay for this. And preferably, they should actually pay for not only doing these conservation activities, they should pay also for the lost possibilities of incomes from standard forest management. But I think that if this is going to happen, then it must be much more of active work from the landowners to offer. You have to give offers to the rest of the society to share the responsibility for preserving a rich biodiversity, for example, or to share to produce the need of carbon sinks during certain limited periods or whatever. But I agree with you completely that this can really go wrong if you are not taking the lead, so to say. So of course you have to be very careful. So the end product, it's not, as we heard also earlier, that it will end up in unmanaged forest, because I think that is kind of the worst case for a sustainable society in the future.
What does the industry think about supporting some of these initiatives and boost the biodiversity concerns in forestry?
I think that the companies are doing very much regarding biodiversity and have been doing for several years as a way of license to operate, I believe. And I think these new possibilities are worth looking into, but I see the risks and definitely see the risk of wood being locked away from the industry if they aren't made in a good way.
Okay. Well, some might say that the risk is there anyhow. That there is pressure enough from the Commission to go beyond what we call sustainable forest management, which is well known, and instead going more into the direction of closer to nature forest management, and come up with indicators, thresholds on how this could be measured, and then probably even certified. So the pressure might come just from top down rather than a more voluntary approach, which I'm assuming was what Professor Thomas was indicating. What do you think of this direction of travel?
Sorry, what is it?
What do you think of the direction of travel, of the closer to nature forest management certification that is being proposed in, next year, but it's already been discussed in Brussels? Only good news from Brussels.
I don't know much about it.
Basically, considering more biodiversity indicators in the way we manage forests.
But, as I said before, it's better if the best one, closest to nature, is the forest, the landowners, the other one who manage their forest. So it's so hard for politicians to sit on the top and decide what to do in a specific area. It just doesn't work. Nature doesn't work that way. We have to work with nature. We can't work against nature. And it's good that they make big strategic plans, but they can't go into like one single landowner and they put demands on what to do and so on. And the big biodiversity comes from many different landowners that manage their properties in the best way. I think that's the best we can do.
Yes, indeed. While the objective is it's good, it still needs to be adapted to the more than 70 types of forests we have in Europe, right? And then the devil is in the details, so to speak. But still on the biodiversity objectives, and this idea that even if they probably need to be adapted to the different types of forests, the indicators such as dead wood and retention trees and things that we already apply to a certain extent in Natura 2000 areas. Do you think that the industry would take up, because it will be a certification at the end of the day, do you think that there will be actually a value added to this type of system that will get, at the end of the day, to the forest owners? Anyone wants to take it?
Maybe not for all the dead trees and so on you leave. We have in Sweden, the system we have in Sweden is like we have a freedom with responsibility, and some things we just have to do because we think it's good for the nature and so on. We can't get paid for everything. We live with nature and we want to have nice forests and different forests that can work for a long time, for generations. So some things we have to do for free, but maybe some things we can get paid for. But as you said before, we have to know what the consequences are when we receive something.
The fact that you might lose freedom if you are dependent on public money.
Yes.
Pierre-Olivier.
In fact, it depends on the way you look at the answer to your question. If it's a top-down approach, I must say we are somehow a little reluctant. If it's a bottom-up approach, and forest owners volunteer for that, because they feel they have the responsibility to do it, the responsibility to develop biodiversity, then I think it should be done. And this is the idea between this label, which had been launched several years ago with the help of the European Landowners Organization, which is the wildlife estates approach, which is exactly that. So, because it's not only forest owners, it's forest and agricultural land owners, but just the same. It's this idea, it's bottom-up approach, you volunteer into a label, and you decide that in your property, you have parts of it which deserves a special approach because the biodiversity there is very special, and we all have that in our forest. I do have that in my forest. There are two streams, and along the streams, of course, we try to keep a certain kind of forest, which is not planting Douglas trees, and of course, and we have to do it. I don't know whether we need to be paid for that, but we know we do it. And it plays a very important role, and it brings to more credibility of foreign management to do that. And as you know, it's already 2 million hectares of land, both forestry and agriculture, which has been put under this labeling. So it does work.
But if it's bottom up, okay.
But it's bottom up.
Let's. Oh, Constantin, you wanted to speak, and I was ignoring you.
Yes, no worry, thank you. I would like to come back to this issue of trade-off between goals. I don't think that's the major issue, personally. If you look at 4 of the goals, at least, water retention, soil retention, biomass, and biodiversity promotion, actually, We have the trade-off available. It's called nature. It's been optimized over millions of years. If you have a proper forest, as per the recommendation published by the European Commission on water retention, making sure that there is forest coverage over water springs and alongside water streams are the two best measures to ensure water retention. The third best is to plant trees where there are no trees, which is basically in town. So there is no question of a trade-off between water retention and the economics of forestry management, so long as your forest is continuous cover. If you look at soil retention, that's exactly the same, with the additional complexity that if you introduce species mix, you will have a better chance to keep your soil as a mul, moder, not more, less acid. So it's a little more complex and closer to what the colleague was saying, that closer to management, closer to nature management is probably a better idea. It's true for soil retention. If you look at biomass, actually, if you end up burning the wood, so long as the wood has been a carbon pump and turned into a carbon sink in the form of material for construction and furniture, and is only burned when it comes from forests that are continuous cover and sustainable, you basically also do not have a trade-off. Maybe you do have a trade-off, and we're addressing it in the hopefully new Czech forestry law, whereby we try to set up a system, a balance between our interests as forestry owners in terms of soil enrichment and the interest of the energy industry in terms of getting access to enough biomass to say, you know, let's agree maybe 50-50. I do not want to return less than 50% of the branches and the small wood in the soil, and I'm only ready to sell you 50% of the remains for burning. So again, maybe there is a trade-off, but it's completely manageable. For biodiversity, it's much more difficult, not so much because of a trade-off in goals, because at the end of the day, again, a closer to nature forest management will produce biodiversity. It's more an issue of space and price. Space, because, for example, we're looking at cultivating, have a specific targets for all the border alongside the forestry roads, where you have 2 meters, 4 meters on each side of the road, which you need to be able to access the forest and manage it, where we could manage it to promote shrubs and therefore insects and therefore birds that will actually fight against the bark beetle a few meters along there. There, the trade-off is more difficult, and in particular because you can put price on clean water. How do you put the price on the value of a rare bark beetle? Not a bark beetle, a rare beetle that is not a bark beetle, sorry. Yeah, so I think, I actually think that the issue is not so much an issue of trade-off, it's an issue of what we as a society are ready to put as a price for a non-merchant service, and how do you arrive at that price in a way that ensures the economic sustainability of those who work with it and the social sustainability of those who are ready to finance it. And that is a much tougher job. And that's why I suggest we start with things that are less difficult to address, which is, for example, water retention.
Well done, well done. Well, another easy one where we can have a, relatively easier approach on the trade-off linked with carbon is, yes, keeping the raw materials in the chain as long as possible, right? And also BECCS then at the end of the day, even if I guess that's really expensive, right? But anyway. Now the audience. Let's see. Hands in the air? You're all shy. Well, we are almost over, it's at 4, so no one wants to give it a try. Everything was super clear. Yes. Okay, then. Oh, we have one. Yes.
Yeah, it's an observation, Anna. You raised it earlier when Thomas was talking about the voluntary carbon markets. I think the liability question is something that came up a lot when we were doing the regenerative agriculture workshops. And there is a wide variation in these schemes or business models that Thomas talked about that are coming up. The better end of ones seem to be those that take the liability as the project developer. So those that bring in the different forest owners or the landowners, and they aggregate it up, and it's them who are responsible for the carbon savings and ensuring that they stay there over the period of accrediting period, so the liability doesn't sit with the actual landowner or the forest owner. The second one, which I think goes a little bit to what Pierre-Olivier is talking about, is you need to be focused on outcomes as opposed to prescribing what needs to be done. And the landowner or the forest owner can then voluntarily decide whether or not they want to enter a scheme or not, what practices that they want to do, and they can decide whether or not they want to be paid for that or not, as the case may be. And I think the third point that underpins all of that is, again, what Pierre-Olivier and others were saying, is it has to be bottom up rather than top down, because ultimately, particularly when we talk about landowners, the primary role is to produce the food, and then any other scheme has to be complementary to that. And then finally, I just pick up on what Konstantin said that I thought was really interesting, is you start with carbon. Maybe carbon is one of the easier ones to do, but then we have to move quickly onto some of the other ones that are not as, but almost as easy to get to, like water retention, and start to put a value on that, and then work out if there's a market that will pay for it. So just some observations on what I heard.
Pretty good ones. I'll probably, we have one. Haha. We go to a Belgian question or comment.
Yeah, Belgium. I hear about water retention. It's been mentioned very often today. But not everybody agree about forest as water retention. In Belgium, I hear very often people from water management and conservation people that, in fact, a tree just pump water from the soil. So there's a sort of a conflict between the approach of water retention and the other vision is just, if you plant tree, you pump water from the soil. What is your opinion about that?
That's a tough one to end, isn't it? Oh, Constantin. And then go ahead.
I love tough questions. That's where we start learning. Our distinguished colleague is right at the level of a tree. It's less true, it's actually wrong at the level of, or partly wrong, at the level of a forest. And that you can feel it when you walk in the forest. You move away from a warm field into a fresh forest. So yes, trees pump water, but they restitute it in the form of a microclimate. And thirdly, we should realize that the water that pours in rain on my head in Central Europe does not come from the sea. It comes from Belgium, or Alsace, or Germany. In other terms, forests are relays for water that evaporates from the sea, pours down 100 kilometers away, and is pumped up again into the sky by forest. And that's why, for example, Brazil had started, unfortunately, that I think that effort has been slowed down, to put it politely, planting trees along the first 100 kilometers away from the sea in order to reduce the desertification of Nordeste. So that's a very good example. I'm very glad that we asked that question, because a very good example of the fact that we cannot look at only at the tree, let alone at the forest. We have to look at the whole system. I hope that helps answer the question.
Was it helpful? Was it, right? Yes. You want to come in?
No,
it was covered?
I didn't know that we had an expert in hydrology. I have nothing to add.
I only drink wine and I don't eat soap.
In fact, about water protection through forest, it has a very complex action Of course, the trees take some water to develop themselves, but globally, the forest has a very positive action in two directions. The first one is it prevents the flow of the water straight away down to the river and to the sea. It keeps the water up in the mountains, up on the hills, and in the soil of the forest, rather than to have it going down and flowing down, even with great problems about that. And as you know, in many places in Europe, especially in the Alps, there have been huge areas of plantation after the Second World War, precisely to prevent the water, both from the snow and from rain, going down the valley and making a lot of difficulties there. And the second point is to have a very positive action on the quality, because it works like a filter. And it has been shown then that the quality of springs or of the water you take under forest has a very high quality as a whole, and it's much better than when you have even arable crops or of course cities, and that's those two dimensions are really very precious, and that's the reason why it's told it's positive on water quality.
Is it working or not? Yes, I perfectly agree with you. I'm not a hydrology specialist, but what I wanted to point is that some other people are thinking differently. I know a place in Belgium where they're going to cut 150 hectares of wood just because they want to make an infiltration place. So, and I found that crazy. Crazy. So we have to communicate about all what has been said to fight against these stupid ideas. Sorry.
We come back to the communication issue. Any solution here?
Not a solution, but examples. There is a very large-scale example, which is outside Europe, and that's in New York State. The city of New York have the choice how to provide high-quality water to the people living in New York. And there were two solutions. The first one was to pump in the Hudson River with a very heavy treatment of water and risk of pollution. And the other one was to bring the water from the mountains in the New York State, in the Catskill Hills mountain, more than 100 kilometers away, and pay forest owners to manage the forest in a certain way so they can bring the quality of water, keep the quality of water at a very high standard. And roughly, it was not needed to treat at all you could eat, and now you have almost spring water in New York City. In fact, it is treated because it's a question of risk as a whole. But in fact, you could almost use it as spring water coming up from the Catskill Mountains, and that's a very large-scale approach on thousands of hectares, and the city of New York paying the forest owners for that service. So it does work.
Without strict protection.
No.
Good. So if okay, we're starting. We need the mic. Yes. And while I know you, more people don't. So you should present yourself.
Yes, Arnis from Latvian Forest Owners Association. When we are talking about climate change, I think it's necessary to talk both about mitigation and adaptation. Some of you already touched adaptation, but I would like to ask you from your point of view, what's the main measures for adaptation? Thank you.
I can start, perhaps. I think that I can perhaps speak for Sweden, and it has for long been an active program developing tree breeding systems for the future. So in a way, it's we are well prepared. So the new seedlings that are planted annually in Sweden, they are like prepared for an estimated future climate change, which means some kind of warming. And so I think we don't speak of this very often, but I think that the general expectation in Sweden is that by adapting, especially planting material, and also to do some changes between where we have what we call spruce and pine sites, we expect actually forest growth to increase in the future as a result of climate change and adaptation. So we are not really, we are sitting in a very favorable situation. We have, of course, as many of you have already told about, been suffering a bit of wrong selections of sites when it comes to spruce because of high grazing pressure that made spruce more popular than pine during some periods. But I think it's not, the climate change is not things that keeps the landowners awake during night in Sweden.
As a Portuguese, I'm so jealous.
And there is a very interesting program financed by the European Union, and the Commission took initiatives. Sometimes they do things that are really interesting. It's called Rainforce. Have you heard of that? It's a program with, I think, 40 different stands from the south of Portugal up to the north of Scotland, and I suppose in Sweden too, where you have a certain number, I think it's 40 or 50 different species being bred in those stands, and looking for those who are mostly adapted to the situation from the south to the north, to see whether you've got species from the south which can be adapted and develop in other situations where they are not known. And for instance, there's one next to my place where it's testing cedar trees from Atlas being planted in Normandy. Nobody would imagine that in the beginning. But then when you think about it, scientists found pollen from cedar trees dating from before the last glaciation just next door, a fossil pollen. So it did exist in the past, but very long ago. And it might be not the solution, but a solution among the others.
And it's actually a good example of what the EU is doing, is in putting more money into research and development for these types of things. What they can be improved is in adaptation strategies that this type of research is actually put in place. But so a positive note. And if that's it is, yes, then I guess your job is done, and a warm applause, please. Yes?